Today, have we reached peak idiocy yet? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance and Analytics, one of the latest posts covering finance and property news. Tarric is back for another chat on a Friday evening. Tarric, hello. The more I look at things, the more I think, help, what on earth is going on?
I feel like, we're definitely getting to some slides on that, but it's just absolutely crazy just the way things are going at the moment. I mean, like even just that announcement by the Australian Federal Police in the last couple of days that they're going to be targeting the purveyors of misinformation. And I get the feeling that judging by some of the arrests in Britain, that some people who are not purveying misinformation may end up being caught up in the crackdown.
Well, misinformation, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. So who is the judge and who is the jury? I think that's a very important point. But when I see things like David Pocock being banned from playing parliamentary sport, for example, right? Or I see the claims from the government that this first-time buyer grant thing is, wonderful, and yet everybody else is saying, "Duh, come on, look at what's really happening." I should have shake my head and think, well, I don't know what land the reality lives in anymore. Now, you and I deal with data, right? Because data is a good foundation for trying to actually talk about things and weigh out things. But the trouble is that the data can be warped and pushed, and for example, Albo says, well, this first time grant improvement process, well, according to Treasury, lift house prices very small amount over the next 6 years, according to Treasury. But of course, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be accurate. And a lot of other people are saying, no, it's going to be a huge rise in the first year. So I don't know. I'm finding it harder and harder to find any sort of sense of a direction. I'm not sure the information compass is actually helping that much. And the political landscape is getting more and more concerning. And as you say, can we in the future talk freely about the things we want to talk about? It's a big question.
It is, and it's rather interesting with regards to Albo's 5% deposit scheme, because at the time of this recording, as far as I'm aware, the modelling for that has not yet been made available to the public or members of the economics community. So it's very much a case of, okay, you say housing prices are not going to rise, but what exactly is that conclusion based on? Because as far as I'm aware, we don't know.
Well, that's convenient, isn't it? Being able to say, well, the Treasury have done some modelling, and so, but yeah, it's not been disclosed. It's not been shared. And look, I can certainly put the data set into my modelling, my core market model, and I come up with something like a 6 to 10% rise in home prices in the categories and areas where first-time buyers are likely to buy. And in fact, of course, there were reports that prices rose by $100,000 on the day. On the day, asking prices rose on the day that this announcement came out and came into effect. So I'm a bit suspicious of any of these. Yes, it'll be fine, Sir Humphrey. I think there's another story here. And remember, 95% loans still mean you borrow 95% of the value of the property, which means that there's still a serviceability and affordability test that has to be passed as well, which means that you need to have well above average incomes in most of the major centres to be able to buy a property. And it's fascinating to me that the banks are still, arguing that, well, of course, we don't need the significant buffer, we can reduce the buffer, etc., etc. And but fascinatingly too, according to a couple of people I've been speaking with, some of the offers to those first-time buyers under the scheme have a higher risk rating within the banks. So that means they get charged a higher interest rate. So there's another side to this story that isn't actually being reported either.
No, definitely. And it's interesting that your modelling says about 6 to 10% increases in housing prices, because there was a paper done by Lateral Economics on the impact of the Albanese government scheme I think it was for the Insurance Council of Australia, and they concluded roughly in the same ballpark as you in terms of price rises within the segments used, frequented by first home buyers. And I just think that's rather interesting that, you've got all these people saying, yes, prices are going to go up. Another one is Louis Christopher from SQM. He mentioned recently on Twitter that he thinks that this is going to be, a rather serious, put a rather serious rocket under the market. And, Louis is, probably the most straight shooter of the straight shooters of, the Australian property commentary world. So I think that, we really need to be cautious here about, how this is going to play out. But unfortunately, caution is not really the order of the day for the Albanese government.
No, no, no. It's all about standing up and appearing in front of the cameras, right at the start of October with somebody who'd magically been able to get a property. The scheme hadn't come in yet, but they were still there, and here's a plant sort of thing. Dear. There is, I think, so much spin. And in fact, I think the spin has now got up to the point where we're just going so fast, we're going to create some sort of meteorological event.
If the spin gets so much faster, you might even just see some sort of some sort of gravity anomaly opening up. It's rather interesting. But I think it's rather funny that, I feel like we're no longer judging policy on its merits, on its effects anymore, because, you've got Claire O'Neill, the housing minister, coming out and saying, oh, but we're being aspirational. We're having a goal. We're working towards something. And it's like, well, that's great. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm glad that we're working towards something, but we're not. We're pretty badly failing at that. And the latest, approvals data shows things, sort of peaking out at a level that's rather uncomfortably low to be able to achieve 240,000 homes a year, every year, until basically 2030. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a serious economist or property expert who believes that's going to happen.
Well, even the Treasury themselves actually put out a warning to the government some time ago, saying it's unlikely you're going to be able to achieve your numbers. You might want to, modify your message slightly. All the industry observers that I read suggest that the approvals are going the wrong way. And I know approvals are lumpy, and when you get a high-rise apartment approved, then the number jumps one month and then drops back the next month. But if you look at the trend, we are consistently below what we would need to achieve. And the other point is the time lag, right? Because of course it takes quite a long time for the approval process to run, and then the construction process to start to run. And if you're building high-rise, it can be 3 years or something or more before you actually get something that you can live in. So the chances of achieving the 1 point whatever it is target, 1.2 is the sort of the official target, but people are saying, well, it can be a bit fluffy anyway. It's highly unlikely that we're going to achieve that. But the other point, of course, is the quality of the property and the nature of the property. So a lot of high rise, a lot of small dog boxes, a lot of places where people don't want to live, because that's the other point that I keep coming back to in my surveys, is a lot of people really don't want to live in small, noisy, high-rise properties, even if they're close into town and things like that, and with a good transport access. And there seems to be a gap between the expectations from politicians of what people are going to actually ultimately live in, and where people actually really want to live and what they want to live in. I think that's something else that people are not actually taking full note of. There are social consequences of living on top of each other in noisy environments with very little parking and all those things available. So there's big questions here, and I really don't think that the discussion has been mature at all. It's almost like, well, we've thrown this target up against the wall and we'll see whether it sticks or not.
Indeed, and I think it's a really, really complex picture out there on this particular question, and it's a really not favourable one for just the Australian people, to be completely frank. I mean, in terms of the actual number of detached houses being completed, I'm not even talking about per capita terms, but just in nominal terms, isn't dissimilar to the 1980s, even though the population has expanded dramatically since the 1980s. And then if you shift your focus to apartments, if you look at a breakdown of apartments, more than 80% of apartments in Australia are of the variety of either a 2-bedroom apartment or less. So that puts that puts the country in a really challenging position, because if you look at the polling numbers from Westpac, most people, something like, I think it's around about 80% of people, even when taking price into consideration, want to live in detached houses or townhouses, with over 60% wanting a detached house. So we are not building enough homes for these people to live in, even if they want to live on the outskirts of the urban fringe. And I think as well, there's also the question of migration in this as well, because a lot of migrants, particularly ones who want to have big families or bring other parts of their family over, also want those big homes, or those freestanding homes. So there's a real major question there to be answered in terms of, are we building enough freestanding homes for Australians to live the way they want to live? And I would say that the answer is very much no.
I think that's exactly right. And the other thing is, if you take account of where people are migrating from, and of course we've got the leaky boat situation from people going into Kiwi land and then coming to Australia. We're seeing a very high and significant drift into Australia from New Zealand at the moment. In fact, there's net negative migration in New Zealand, which we might come on to in a second or two. But when you actually look at what people want to buy, as you say, it's very different from what the politicians are pushing construction of. Now, of course, there are significant interests here in terms of some of those big developers who want to build high and they want to build small because, of course, it's a per unitized return that they get. But actually, if you look at the costs of construction to build high, they are actually quite a lot higher. And in fact, the average cost of construction for a new property at the moment is rising still faster than wages growth or even credit growth. So there's a problem there with regard to, well, what will this new stuff cost, even if people want to buy it? But then, as you say, there's a real focus on standalone homes and low-rise development, and a lot of people would prefer to live there. And so what we're seeing at the moment is quite a significant price rise in some of those areas. Now, when you actually take average aggregate data about home price moves, of course, the totality data or the domain data or whatever would actually be doing. What you're seeing is an average aggregate, which doesn't tell you very much at all. And you need to sort of parse it out and look at it by property type and location. And if you do that, what you see is that there are some property types where prices are still rising quite strongly, but there are also property types where, in fact, the value is still slipping. And it's fascinating to sort of parse that out and realize that maybe some of these reported average aggregates really mislead rather than actually inform.
It's interesting that you should mention that, because I was going through the data from Trade Me in New Zealand. Now, this is for rents, not for property prices, but I just thought it was interesting nonetheless. What they found was that in terms of large properties, rents weren't, like really large properties, I'm talking 5 bedrooms or larger, rents weren't falling. There was still demand there for those larger homes. But in terms of the smaller homes, both, the sort of normal 3, 4 bed family homes and the 2 bedroom and lower apartments, that is where you're seeing concentrated rental price falls, which I just thought was rather interesting, given that the demographic forces and the various forces that work within the Kiwi economy, because you would be thinking that, well, there's still demand for these types of family homes, and yes, there is. But once you take those sort of additional boosters of housing demand, things do start to normalize, even in those high demand sectors.
That's a very good point. I actually made a show yesterday referring specifically to the 0.5% rate cut in New Zealand because the economy there is stalling. Home prices are still falling on aggregate, but if you look at it, as you say, it's not uniform. There are areas where they're going up and where they're going down. But what I found really interesting was the debate in New Zealand is now perhaps that it's going to be the case that people's expectations are changing with regard to where home prices are going to go. Maybe people are getting used to the fact that home prices don't always go up. On average, well, it's somewhere between 21% and 13%, depending on where you look and how you look. But of course, Auckland in particular has been quite negatively impacted. And I thought it was quite interesting that the Reserve Bank over in New Zealand, when they were talking about that the drivers of the economy, seemed to be sort of playing down some of the international concerns with regard to trade and things, but did actually say, well, the local economy is pretty weak. But I thought the most fascinating point here is the migration trend. So in New Zealand, migration is still quite strongly negative. Previously there were 100,000, a time over in New Zealand. Now they're negative. And so even when you cut rates dramatically, as now has happened in New Zealand, the truth is that home prices are still going down. Well, the other interesting observation is that I think Luxton in New Zealand was saying, well, it'd be good if prices started to rise. But the housing minister said, no, it's actually quite good that home prices are going down. And so there's a little bit of an interesting debate about, well, maybe home prices falling is positive rather than negative. So that's an interesting debate. We don't have that in Australia, of course.
No, and I think some of the media commentary in New Zealand has been really, really interesting, as well as some of the polling that's been done over there as well. Because there's data that's been reported in the Kiwi press that when asked about the impact of falling housing prices, which is obviously falling rather significantly in New Zealand, and very nearly to the point of, US GFC financial crisis housing crash levels, most people are just like, oh, well, it's not a bad thing. It's just, it is what it is. And there's not that negative, that hugely negative connotation that you would expect attached to it by Kiwi households. And the thing that's really interesting about that is it's not that Kiwi households aren't just as property obsessed as Australians, like they've had the same things with, with property investors, the same things with housing bubbles and everything like that. I mean, there's a reason why property prices can fall so far and still be, highly unaffordable for large swaths of the population. But I just found that commentary very interesting, particularly in light of the recent news poll data here in Australia that shows that the single largest cohort out of people who want prices to either rise, fall, or stagnate is the cohort that wants prices to keep rising. Yet, when actually confronted with it, people don't seem to actually care that much, which I think is interesting. I feel like it's one of those, I have this opinion, but I don't hold it very, very strongly.
Yeah, and I suppose you can argue that, well, of course, if you're sitting on an asset, you would prefer it to rise in value rather than fall in value. And of course, even with the rise in the rental sector, 2/3 of households own a property either outright or with a mortgage in Australia. So you've got a natural weight on the side of, well, I'd prefer prices to rise. But when actually you pare that back a little bit and start asking people about, for example, affordability for their kids and the nature of the economy going forward, when you have a slightly more sophisticated conversation, certainly in my one-to-one conversations and in my surveys, I do see people taking a much more sensible approach here and saying it was ridiculous. You can't go along with 9 times, 10 times income and expect things to go well. And maybe there's an opportunity to, reset opinion. But of course, the spruiking in the media over the last few weeks with regards to home price growth, whoopee, everybody's got to buy, investors, storming back, credit growth up, and twice the level of inflation, which is consistent. It's a problem. But the point I've always had is there are vested interests in those people wanting to talk prices up. But when you talk to real people, they're much more balanced and they're much more nuanced about this. And there are a lot of people who say, well, actually, we've been led up the garden path with this over quite a long period of time, but the government doesn't want to fix it, do they?
No, and I think that there's very much a path there politically for someone to come in and actually explain what the cost of housing is doing to the economy. How, okay, it's all good for people to say, well, if you look at the data, stuff that you and I have spoken about previously, you look at, say, for example, household consumption. It's hitting people under the age of 45 the hardest because they're having to take on these enormous mortgages and pay these higher rents. But if you take a step back and you look at it from an economy-wide perspective, and you go back in time and you look at, say, the last 40 years of data, right? And then you say, okay, what proportion of household income is being spent on housing? Right? Now you're talking about very nearly a 10 percentage point rise between 1984 and 2016, which is unfortunately where this data stops, which is very inconvenient because the ABS discontinued it. Well, as far as I know, it's discontinued. The next release date is TBA, and it's been 9 years. But I just think that's really interesting because there's all this extra cash flowing into the cost of housing, flowing into rents, flowing into mortgages, And that's cash that isn't flowing through the economy. It's not cash that's being spent. It's not cash that's then, you know, having the positive economic multiplier effect of then just cascading through the economy of, you going to the gym, and then the personal trainer pays the coffee shop owner, and so on and so on and so on. So you're missing that virtuous cycle that you would otherwise get. And instead we just go, well, people just say, oh well, people can afford it, they're not defaulting, ergo it's fine. But what they should be looking at as well is, what's it doing to the economy? People might be able to take it at a household level with the 2-minute noodle experience, but can the economy take it?
No, I think that's a great question, Tarek, and certainly the economy is languishing because of the fact that people have less disposable income. I made a show the other day called How Real Households Are Coping with the Property Pickle, because I do think it is a property pickle, despite the hype. And I've got this pile of properties in the middle of the Brisbane River, with people trying to get to them but unable to, and the vultures overhead, which sort of, to me, rather sort of typified the problem we've got. But the broader economic story is that high housing prices are an economic drag, not an economic stimulator. And that's the critical point to understand. Now, okay, banks can increase their balance sheets because they lend more because house prices rise. And that is a very significant element in the liquidity dynamo that's being created. But that's helping the banks. That's not helping the real economy. And when you look at it, in my surveys, and this is referring to those surveys, a lot of people are spending 40 to 45% of their net disposable income just covering their property needs, either by rents or by mortgage. And that is a lot compared with where it used to be, which means they have less money to spend on other things. And so that then goes to the question of, well, how do you prioritize and what do you spend on? And again, in my surveys, I see quite a few people who are cutting back on dental treatment, for example, or things like that, or having to pull kids away from school because of school fees, or cutting back on the quality of the food that they're buying, or paying a whole lot more in terms of the charges to go from one place to another place because they live a long way out and there are lots of toll roads on the route and things like that. So there are real consequences here, economic consequences. And I have to say, I think the Reserve Bank has done a really, really bad job in its most recent documents at trying to show the true impact. No, they say everything's fine. Households are fine. Real incomes are growing. And then they quote the Hilda data from some time ago and their own securitized data sets, which is a very myopic view of, and say, everything's fine, folks. There's nobody defaulting. And so, but you can't just measure it in terms of mortgage defaults, not at least when the banks, of course, continue to extend and pretend and give people interest holidays and extend the loan term and things like that. There is a broader economic conversation we should be having here about the thing that is sucking the blood out of the broader economy.
Indeed, I was going to ask, because obviously, you've got your finger on the pulse on this, but how has housing costs as a proportion of income evolved over, say, like the last decade in your data? Because that's really the missing link in the ABS numbers.
Well, I calculate it on net disposable. So, in other words, I start with, tell me about the income that's coming into the household. Tell me about the costs that are going out. Tell me, and then we do some work in terms of the tax calculations thing, because you have to use net disposable. You can't use gross income as a measure, I don't think. So once you look at net disposable, it varies by cohort, of course, but today there are a lot in the 40s. If you go back a decade, it was in the 30s. If you go back 2 decades, it was in the 20s. 25, 27% would be the aggregate average. We crossed the Rubicon into the 30s when interest rates were cut and people started to get really big mortgages, and that then drove prices. So we had that first run up after the interest rate cuts, and we went into the 30s. And then since we've had the recent turnarounds, we're now in the 40s. And it's interesting, there are still people who are getting mortgages on 9 to 10 times net disposable income. And when you do that, when you run the calculations, you're closer to 50% of your net disposable income just going on the mortgage. And for those in the rental sector, it's equally as bad. And of course, I report in a postcode level each month what the net disposable actually is. I've got that data going back quite a long way now, so it's quite interesting because it's not uniform, right? So there are some areas, but what's interesting is that when you look at the percentages, it's not just the low income households that are affected. It works out the income scale, so you can actually find more affluent suburbs where, again, people are highly leveraged, 40 to 50% of their income going on their mortgage. So there's a fundamental paradigm shift that's happened in the household financing story and about, I guess, what people are prepared to pay to be able to get into the property sector. But it's not good and it's not healthy. And it means that people, particularly in the middle income range, are making some very hard trade-offs between what they spend money on and what they don't spend money on. And one of the things they say is, well, I don't have the disposable income that I had, so I have to prioritize, and I won't do as much as I used to. So that doesn't help the broader economic dynamo in the country, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think the thing is as well is that that's also then just reflected in consumer spending, obviously, because it's a mechanical. If you have less money to spend, you will spend less money. It's that simple. But I also feel like there's also a confidence aspect as well, whereby people just don't feel as comfortable spending that kind of money, even if they have it, as they perhaps used to, at least until you get to that sort of, generally speaking, it's an age demographic, sort of starting generally in people's 50s. It depends on exactly which data source you're talking about. Sometimes it's 50, sometimes it's 55. That also tends to coincide, according to data from the Victorian government, when people start getting inheritances. And then once they hit super preservation age, then they also you start to see people start to spend down their super. So I feel like we're very much seeing that K-shaped economy across the various different age and income demographics.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I see that in my surveys too. That there are definitely more options for people who've actually gone through that. I've owned my property for some time. I've paid the mortgage down. I've got pensions around the corner or superannuation around the corner. I've got some savings now. But the trouble is, of course, the housing formation is 10 years older than it used to be. So the current cohorts, that's going to be their 70s rather than their 60s or the 50s, right? So that's the first point. The second point is that the journey to owning your property is longer because the average mortgage now is a lot longer than it used to be. And that means that people are going to be in debt into their dotages, as it were. And it also means that when they are still paying a mortgage into retirement, they have a then choice. Do they actually grab some of the superannuation and throw it to kill the mortgage, which means, of course, they've got a lower superannuation balance in their own, which means they're probably on the government pension again. So, the government ends up paying. Or do they just go on paying and paying and paying? But if you're in the rental sector and you're older and you go into retirement, you still got to pay rent. So that's the story I think that we should be understanding. And so you need to go into this dynamic of different cohorts and things like that. But just on the consumer's confidence, the Roy Morgan data show that it fell again. And I'm quite amused by the reporting about consumer confidence because, of course, there's been quite a lot of headline news. Confidence is rising. Yeah. Just look where it is. So it dropped to a low in the COVID period. And then it nearly dropped to that same low in 2023. And it's come up slightly, but it's well below the long-term average. And I just am amazed how we seem to be making headlines without any context, right? So consumers are, no. The data says consumer confidence is still extremely low, which goes right back to they won't spend. Of course they don't spend. They can't spend. So there's a bigger story here, and I'm afraid that a lot of the reporting of this stuff is just, to say it's limited is very concerning. And it comes to this broader question, and get your slides now. This is beginning to actually come to the question of why we have potentially a lost decade in Australia, and why it is that the overall economy is just not firing right, and why so many people are actually quite concerned about their financial position and the broader story with regard to where Australians headed.
As usual, the charts will be available at burnouteconomics.com, along with a link to my YouTube channel, which will have various clips and stuff from DFA and in the future, hopefully some other stuff.
That cartoon there, that's chilling, but so true.
Yeah, I thought long and hard about whether I was going to include it or not, and then I just thought to myself, you know what? Well, you got to have a laugh. You know, like if I think it was the crew of HMS Sheffield during the Falklands War that after the ship got sunk, that they all just sat there in their lifeboats in their life vests in the cold waters of the South Atlantic, and they sang, "Always look on the bright side of life."
Yeah.
So I thought, well, you know what? Let's find some humor in it at least.
I think that's very good. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I just wanted to call that out because that was brilliant. Go ahead. You go.
No worries. As always, people, it's all available at burnouteconomics.com. Any support, subscribers is very much appreciated. So we'll get right into the slides. Now, this is a good one. This relates to what Martin was saying about the whole lost decade thing. And I think it's interesting because Japan is seen as this poster child of we must avoid this. We must not go down the same road as Japan. And in some ways, I thoroughly agree with that. I think that we need to be very careful to not get overly indebted. We need to be very careful to not engage in these enormous set bubbles. And we need to be careful to not follow them down the same path of demographic decline and making it harder and harder for people to have children. And obviously, all the negative consequences that come with that. Now, a lot of people in the media or in the world of finance and economics talk about Japan's lost decade, about how it's something that needs to be avoided. And yeah, sure, you agree it's something that you would very much like to avoid. Yet, if you take Japan's lost decade from the time the bubble burst in 1990 through to 2000, and Australia's last decade, which is just literally the last 10 years of GDP data, in per capita terms, Australia is performing worse than Japan did during its lost decade. And I think that just tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it?
Well, it's a very important thing, but I'll tell you something else. If you were to overlay the trend of home prices in Japan over that same 10-year period and Australia, there will be a dramatic difference.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. It'd be literally it would just be a cross, because Japan goes from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo being worth more than every single piece of real estate in California to just tanking precipitously, and Australian home prices have just gone from strength to strength. I mean, admittedly, there's been some cycles in there, but still, we're a whole galaxy away from where we were in 2015. But I just think it's interesting that we keep being told that we need to avoid all these various pitfalls, and then we just fall into them and just paper over the cracks with government spending and migration.
Yeah, and of course, the point to underscore is if, in fact, home prices hadn't been supported by massive government stimulus and support, as well as very loose lending, then the GDP outturn for Australia will be even worse, which means that the lost decade would have been even worse than it was, because the story has always been that it has been the housing sector which has sort of been the crotch, which has effectively helped to sort of support everything else. But it doesn't really necessarily work that well, particularly, of course, now, because you can't go on extending the elephant forever. And that's the real point here. I've mixed a couple of interesting metaphors there. But the point there is that this is an elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, right? Nobody wants to understand that the reason we've got an economic problem is housing, because as we said earlier on, housing is sucking all the oxygen out of the room, and yet housing has been the thing that has managed magically to support the GDP, despite the fact that we are still, according to this chart, not doing as well as Japan did. So that just highlights. I suppose the other point is that it suggests that if we're going to find a way out of this, we need much lower interest rates. Heard that before.
I find it funny because this is what Japan looked like being kicked multiple times very hard. Multiple recessions, multiple economic contractions, some very, very challenging times. Yet somehow our performance on a per capita basis has been worse. And I just think that's just a crazy statistic because we haven't had our downturn. We haven't had the sort of headline challenging times that Japan has had, or that Japan had over that particular period. What we've had is an expansion in the size of day-to-day government spending enormously to the which is currently, as of the last piece of data from the ABS, the second highest quarterly reading in history for day-to-day government spending. The only one that's higher is during the absolute height of the pandemic, when the government was just throwing money at the economy like crazy. And also during that time, Australian resource exports in real terms reached almost $500 billion a year, surging dramatically from where they were in a somewhat depressed state in 2015. Yet we're not seeing that prosperity, we're not seeing that spending translate into dramatically better outcomes for the Australian people.
Absolutely. And of course, GDP was influenced by the very high migration, per capita, of course, which is another factor in there as well. And I'd also make the point that, of course, in Japan, through their journey, the government ended up acquiring more and more of the stock market, and basically are holding huge amounts of assets on their balance sheet at the moment. So the overall story on the government debt side might be a bit different, but the debt levels in Australia are still extremely high compared to history. And of course, the cost of that debt is now rising. And again, a lot of that investment is actually just on day to day. And I don't think you saw the Chris Richardson piece from the other day, but he highlighted the fact that you've got this other pool of debt, which is sort of not in the sort of the standard cycle of debt, which is still another load of liabilities that the government actually has, which means that in real terms, we've thrown a lot more government money at the economy than the official statistics would suggest.
No, I totally agree. No, Chris is absolutely right in that. He talks quite a lot about, and he talks quite a lot about the off-balance sheet stuff, and he's absolutely correct. We can't just keep moving this stuff off. Although, to be completely honest with you, if you look at the numbers from the ABS, in which strips out all the various smokes and mirrors and everything like that, and which just looks at public spending in terms of, say, like investing in the future. Public spending as a proportion of GDP today is about 3 or 4 percentage points, or about up to about 40% lower than it was during the sort of previous high population growth points in Australia's history. So I think it's just worth noting that the way that the government has been achieving these better budget numbers, the way that they've been able to spend more on day-to-day spending, is by underspending on the future, on infrastructure, on all these various things that we need to have not only a functioning, vibrant society, but also on the things that help us have a more productive economy.
Yes, absolutely. It's day-to-day spending. And, you can go on doing that for a period of time, but if you're not investing in the future, then the future falls apart.
Well, exactly. And if you want to get it into like per capita numbers and deflate it by the number of people by the number of people that we're growing the working age population by, then it really starts to get even more challenging. And that's part of the problem, because when you're growing the population back in the day, say in the 70s, for example, through regular old childbirth, you've got years to think about that. You've got 5 years to think about a school. You've got 17 years to think about a road. You've got all these years to think about all these different demands that person will place on public infrastructure, and the sort of broader picture from an economic perspective. But when you start importing people who are fully grown adults, they need that stuff now. And if they don't have that stuff now, and if that means that other people, whether they be newly arrived migrants or whether they be existing Australians, if they don't have the tools that they need, that's bad for productivity, which is bad for the economy, and it's bad for wages. And to be completely honest with you, it's bad for pretty much everybody.
Absolutely. Well, that probably explains to an extent why the most recent Essentials poll really put a very important spotlight on optimism versus pessimism, but also very importantly by different cohorts.
Indeed, it did. Now, this one I found really fascinating because it shows how optimistic or pessimistic people are about the future by age demographic. And, well, young people are more optimistic than anyone, but that's that tends to be the optimism of youth. That's not an uncommon thing in polls. But the interesting thing is that the pessimists outnumber the optimists in every single age demographic. That people don't think that the future is going to get better for for Australia. And I'm just going to just sort of do a little bit of a slideshow here, and that's reflected here. This is from the ANZ Consumer Confidence Report. Now, Martin Rees just shared the headline index earlier in the show. This one is specifically about how people think that the next 5 years are going to play out. So this is about economic conditions over a longer term time horizon. And it recently collapsed to its lowest level in at least a decade, possibly ever. I'm not sure. I need to see if I can get my hands on this data going back to the start of the ANZ index. But suffice to say, it's in a very, very bad place. And people are not confident at all about where the future is going. And I think that this should be ringing absolute alarm bells, because there's this narrative that, oh, well, Albo got elected, or this person got re-elected, ergo they have the support of the public. Well, no. They've got more support of the public than the opposition does. But as this data illustrates, this doesn't necessarily mean that people are optimistic about the future and optimistic about the performance that they're going to put in. So it's a very complex and unfortunately rather challenging picture.
Yeah, I think it's very important, and it's consistent with some of the other data that I've seen. Now, there is the misery index, which is the Melbourne Institute Westpac measure, which is sort of a combination of inflation and unemployment. And the expectation there is that maybe inflation's coming down a bit or not, unemployment may be coming down a bit or not. But even that is gone in the wrong direction more recently. But when you talk to people, their sense of the future and the expectations for the future have just got diluted and diluted. And I think you can sheet that back to the fact that people are getting more and more, well, frankly, skeptical about politicians and their ability to actually make any difference at all. And maybe that's part of the problem, that in fact pretty much all the government parties from either side of politics, are in the same bucket. They're not seen as really being that helpful in terms of actually laying a future. Because really, there's no future vision from anyone. There's no sense of what they want Australia to be and how they're going to get there. And it's almost like, well, we won't look up. We'll just look at the next 2 months or 3 months, and we'll try and just get through that. So there's a real big problem. And unfortunately, when you look at this data in other places as well, in the UK or in some of European countries, the same negativity is there too. So there's a big question for the political establishment about why it is that they're actually, well, destroying people's confidence in the future.
I think part of the issue is that people are not confident in politicians' ability, the leaders, the ability of leaders to actually pursue an agenda that will benefit them. If you look back on some of these old, sort of archival footage from the 60s or the 70s, and you look at these interviews that they're just with the regular people on the street, these like candid things that they used to do for the news or a variety show back in the day, people had faith in their politicians. They believed in their politicians. They thought, okay, I don't necessarily agree with everything that Richard Nixon, for example, is doing. I may even very much dislike him as a person, but I believe that he has the best interest of the country at heart. Maybe he's pursuing that in a way that I don't agree with, but I believe that he's doing what he thinks is best for the country. Now, I don't think that's true anymore. I don't think that people believe that the government is doing what's best for the country anymore. Like in the national interest, I think that that's something that's quite rare, and I find that there's a lot of equivocating of, oh, but the electoral this, the votes that, the electorate, the public, the blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, it's not about that, is it? It's about the future. It's about the country. It's not about their election, their pension, them staying in a job. It's about the future. And that's what it should come down to. And it's deeply sad that that's not the way that it is today. And that's a huge part of why we're in this mess.
Well, the surveys, I think, also showed the national mood is, a lot of more people are thinking we're going the wrong direction than the right direction, right? which is actually worth thinking about. And I think you might have a chart on that as well.
Indeed, I do. This is also from Essential. And as you can see, since about the middle of 2023, more people have said that Australia is on the wrong track than going in the right direction. Now, earlier today, I was actually looking through the even more granular data on this, which does it by age demographic and gender. And I found something very, very interesting. The people who were the most negative about the future, who thought not the most negative, who thought Australia was on the wrong track, was women by a very, very substantial margin. And I think that's rather interesting, given the fact that, generally speaking, women voters favoured the government and the Greens more so than they did the opposition. So I think that just goes to show that, despite the fact that this cohort voted for the government and voted for the left, it doesn't mean that they have faith in them to deliver better outcomes, to put the country on the right track and go in the right direction.
Well, let me hypothesize something which I've been seeing in some of my data. But of course, now to be able to get a property or a mortgage for a property, you need 2 full-time incomes. And that means that, if you've got a standard, set of relationships, you've got a husband and a wife, both of whom now are working full-time to be able to try and actually pay the mortgage. And it's fascinating when I look at that and look at some of the comments in my surveys and my one-to-ones. A lot of people feel that the accelerator has just been turned up to the max, and the treadmill is now going faster and faster and faster. And that means that both parties are actually having to work pretty much all the time there is. And maybe that's part of the reason. So, why are we doing all of this? And I was having a really interesting conversation the other day, and I'm happy for me to relay this, was we stopped and started to ask, why are we doing this? Why are we working so blooming hard just to be able to get a mortgage, to be able to live, to be able to work, to get a mortgage to live? And it was like the treadmill, right? And I feel that that's part of the issue here. I think a lot of people feel trapped on this never-ending treadmill, but it's not going anywhere. It's just going round and round and round and round and round. And I think that's part of the issue here. So I do think there were some really important social and economic and very consequential issues that are actually here under the surface.
I concur. I think that there's some very, very, interesting and complex questions here, because there's a recent poll in the UK reflected this as well. When asked, do you think if Britain is broken, again, significantly more women than men said yes. And when asked in this same Essential poll, do you think migration is generally beneficial to Australia or not generally beneficial to Australia, significantly more women said that the migration was not beneficial than men. And I just find all this just very interesting, that it's just turning conventional sort of ideological alignment on its head. And I think that there's very much fertile ground here for a third-party populist who can connect with those women voters over their concerns, because that's something that the coalition and, generally speaking, One Nation has struggled to do.
I think it's also directly connected to the low birth rate as well, which is in turn having a very significant consequence in terms of the demographic profile ahead. So all of these things are somewhat connected. And what I always find fascinating is that people, when they feel trapped by the system and feel that they don't have any voice to influence the way the system is working, that actually leads to a lot of apathy, firstly. Well, there's no point because they won't change anything. Or even worse, saying, well, maybe it's time to, try and escape the system. Do I leave the country or whatever? Or change completely and go off into regional Australia and do something. All of those sorts of things are in the mix. But these are really, really critical social issues. And I just don't think many of the mainstream politicians are connected. They're in the Canberra bubble and they're being paid quite handsomely for, I'm not sure what sometimes. But real Australians and real families are in a whole different world, and many of them are still in a world of pain. And I think that is not being reflected in a lot of the official releases from the politicians, nor indeed a lot of the coverage. And going right back to the first-time buyer thing, as though that's going to be magically solving the problem. No, it's not. There's a much, much deeper set of issues here. And you're right, there is potential for maybe a populist, to pop up and begin to have a different narrative here, and potentially, move the dial. In the UK, of course, we've got both major parties now behind the Reform Party. They've only got a very few politicians, but the Reform Party is now creating huge momentum in the UK. And the main reason is because they sound different.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally just. I think it comes down to this: like on the day after the US election in 2016, the author and, well, I guess you call him a TV host as well, Michael Moore, went on, I think it was CNBC News in the morning, to talk about what played out. And what unfolded was very interesting. There was no commercials, and the host just let the debate run. And it was basically just Michael Moore just tearing the Democratic Party establishment and its allies in the media absolutely to shreds for their utter stupidity for creating the conditions that led to Trump's election in the first place, that created the fertile ground for his type of populism. And he said that Trump is a human Molotov cocktail that the people of the United States could throw at the political establishment to tell them that they had enough. And I think he was absolutely right about that. And they threw that particular human Molotov cocktail at the political establishment almost 9 years ago. And they've learned absolutely nothing. And, even in Britain, Brexit, similar story, 2016, similar situation where, lobbing the old Molotov cocktail at the political establishment. And did they listen? No. They said they'd cut migration, and then they raised it to the highest level ever. It's just a joke.
Absolutely. And they said they cut taxes and then lifted taxes, and the tax rate take in the UK and in Australia is higher than it's ever been. And, it's all part of this. Yeah. So there's an illusion, which I think we need to sort of look behind the curtain and just realize that maybe there's an alternative story that needs to be told. Now, talking about alternative stories, I mentioned earlier on the building data, and in fact, you've got a chart on the costs of building per square meter, which is a killer.
Yes, I do. This is part of an article that I did a few months ago, which goes back to 1986 in terms of the cost to build a new house per square meter adjusted for inflation. Now, because this is something that I've talked about quite a lot, about how the cost of building a house has changed over time. And a lot of people have said to me, well, what about the fact that homes have gotten larger? And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. So I thought, okay, I will go through the data, I will, do the research and figure out how much the cost to build a house per square meter has changed. And as you can see, even after being adjusted for inflation, it's risen by over 80% compared with where it was prior in the late 1990s, which is a whole heap further than wages growth. Now, if you want to have a look at this article in full, which has got obviously a much more in-depth analysis, I'll get Martin to put a link in the description below. But I think this just really illustrates just how hard it is to just get housing supply going in Australia, because it has gotten so much more expensive relative to incomes, which really puts the sort of fly in the ointment of building enough homes for the expansion of the populace, the changing of the demographics, etc., but also of building enough detached homes, because those are the ones that most Australians really want.
Yeah, well, as we said earlier on, that's exactly the problem. And even the small high-rise, those costs are rising. In fact, they're rising quite a lot bigger than some of the low-rise, because, of course, you need more steel to go into the ground, and you need perhaps different skills to be able to put these boxes up in the sky. And it's fascinating to me that when you actually start thinking about this, a lot of builders and developers, when they run the numbers, can't actually make a turn on the project that they want to go with at the moment, because the costs are still rising. And so they look to government or they go to the build to rent sector where you get massive tax breaks and things like that. So no, normal everyday bread and butter construction is well, it's not really profitable at all for many people. Now, a lot of that is to do with the costs of approvals, etc., etc. But it's also wages, costs of materials, and all the other stuff. And as you say from this chart, you can see it's not just inflation, because in real terms, those have gone up dramatically. So we have a major problem, which is a very interesting conundrum when you think about our earlier conversation about, well, could house prices ease back? Well, if house prices fall and the costs of construction continue to rise, then you've got an even more difficult situation ahead.
I think that one of the interesting things about this particular situation is just how little heed it's being paid by policymakers. Like, we really, there's just this, oh, well, we're going to build 240,000 homes a year. It's going to be hunky dory. We're aspirational. Isn't that fantastic? When you start talking to people in industry, they say, well, that's not going to happen, is it? We're facing all these huge challenges. It's unprofitable, but there's no real shift from policymakers to get things going again. And I think one of the funny things is when you look at dwelling completions per construction worker, they've absolutely plummeted since the early 1990s. And it's like we've got the labor on paper, but in reality, we just don't have the capacity without redeploying that labor in a better way. And to be completely honest with you, it's also the fact that because of government compliance and because of the way that, well, for want of a better word, how economies have evolved over the last 20, 25 years, that we've seen the rise of the white-collar construction worker, which in a lot of cases aren't actually contributing to increased productivity at the coal face, which is then putting further, and these people have got to get paid, so which puts further upward pressure on costs, but doesn't unfortunately end up putting upward pressure on completions.
No, I wonder whether we're going to see the AI tradie popping up. The robot that can actually lay the bricks or whatever, right? Maybe that's a way of dealing with the productivity question in the construction sector, because at the moment productivity has gone through the floor, literally. And when you actually look at how long it takes now for the average thing to be built, it takes a lot longer than previously. Now, why is that? Is it because of all the bells and whistles we now expect in our properties? Or is it just that the skills that people had years ago no longer exist? Well, maybe some of that too. It's hard to know, but I've had some very interesting conversations with people in the building industry sector, which says, well, unless we get a revolution, robots or something, the cost of construction will continue to rise because the cost of labor continues to rise, and it's an impossible story. So, yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but maybe the answer is to go live in a hole in a cave somewhere rather than build up.
Yeah, I don't know, mate. I think, unfortunately, I think your source in the construction sector is unfortunately correct. Like, unless there is appetite from the government for real, genuine, transformative change to sort of get productivity going in the construction sector again, which I don't think there will be, because it's not really in the interest of, the housing price economy, then yeah, I think it's just going to be down to technological innovation to potentially start putting downward pressure on building costs. But by the same token, this is Australia. If we do actually manage to put downward pressure on building costs, we'll just make it up with higher land costs, because it'll just be like, borrow away.
Exactly right. Yeah, I'm afraid that's pure Australia. Now, next interesting conversation point is the rental story, right? Now, fascinating. There's a very interesting correlation between high migration and rents, right? Turn off migration, guess what happens to rents?
Indeed. This is on this chart we have the data from the Trade Me Rental Index, which is for New Zealand, which is on the chart on the right. And on the left here, we have the data from rentals.ca, which is a big Canadian sort of their realestate.com, but for rentals. And as you can see, in both instances, nationwide rents are falling fairly significantly. And I think that's just a really, really fascinating thing. The fact that in both instances, both countries have cut migration and both countries are seeing falling rents. Now, there's been a few people who've said to me, "Oh, but wait a minute, but that's because both of their economies are not in great shape," and that is true. But if you look at the data, it takes an absolutely seismic hit to households to actually drive down rents to a significant degree over a long period of time, like we've seen in some of these places. And I don't think that the hit that these people have taken, at least in terms of, like the unemployment story, etc., is anywhere near large enough to drive down rents to this degree. I think it's more likely about supply and demand, and also just the fact that prices got just elevated in the first place, and now that demand is pulling back, it's just the tide going out.
Yeah, and if you compare the rental trends in the UK and Australia, both of which are still rising, so costs of rent are rising, in those two, migration is still extremely high. And in New Zealand and in Canada, they turn the dials down. And all of the evidence suggests that, in fact, it's the migration lever that is very much connected to the rent growth lever or the rent fall. And folks, rents can fall, but only if the policy settings are appropriate.
Indeed, and just on the topic of the UK, it's an interesting one because the UK very much stands alone as part of the Anglosphere when it comes to dwelling completions per capita, and for all the wrong reasons. The UK builds less than half the number of new homes per capita as Australia. So even though Australia's migration is high and higher than the UK, in some ways the UK is faring just as badly because of the fact that they can't build houses for crap in terms of, in terms per capita terms.
Absolutely. And in fact, you've got a chart a couple on about the attitudes towards migration by different nations. We might flick to that because there's a really interesting correlation here between what's happening in different places.
Yes, we shall, certainly. Now, this this data comes from a Toulouse School of Economics study that quizzed the general public and politicians with a questionnaire about various different issues. This particular one relates to migration. So basically, what it intended to do was to take across 27 countries, determine where politicians were at ideologically, and then compare that at the average with members of the public. And as you can see from the chart, the public, in net terms, in all of the assessed nations here, believe that migrants should be required to adapt to the cultures and to the priorities of their new homeland. That is a majority view in all 6 of these major nations. And then you look at the politicians. In 5 out of 6 of the nations, the politicians do not believe in net terms that migrants should be required to adapt. The only one that's the outlier where both the public and the politicians are on the same page is Denmark. And in Denmark, there's tight migration. There's a very heavy emphasis on integration, on learning the language, on learning the values. And if you don't, well, you're not going to have a good time in terms of staying there because there's a very, very limited number of spots with which to become a Danish citizen. And there's quite a few people who think that is the right way to go about things, that there should be a premium put on integration and on people adapting to the values of the place that they're migrating to, or in a word, to, when in Rome, to do as the Romans do.
Well, it's certainly a big debate in the UK at the moment, particularly after recent events. And more and more people are questioning the degree of integration. And there was a Conservative politician who actually was accused of being very, very aggressive with regard to this, saying, well, he walked around a particular area of Birmingham and didn't see anything white at all And people say, "What? You can't say that." But there's a big debate going on now about the degree of integration, and even in Australia, of course, you can look at the waves of migration over history and how they've tended to fit into particular geographies, and you can go from one geography to another geography, and traditionally have quite different characteristics. And I guess the real question is how much integration is appropriate, and how much cultural norms should be shared. And it's a real tricky one, but I do think that the public have definitely shifted their views relatively recently, particularly in Australia, and are questioning now the whole migration story, both in terms of numbers, the qualification to get in, and the integration. So this is another very important social aspect of thinking about the future.
I think that the migration question is got like there's different sort of sides and aspects to it, because I think that in terms of this particular thing from the Toulouse School of Economics, I think that Australians are all very much on the same page as their European counterparts. I think that Australians believe and have always believed in what is basically Australian cultural and values-based primacy. That we are a what do you call it? That basically when you come to Australia, you have to adopt at least to a fairly significant degree our values.
Mm.
Our attitude to egalitarianism, to a fair go, to not being prejudicial, to gender equality, all these various different things, which still in some of the nations that we welcome migrants from on a regular basis are not present to the degree that we would require of people in the West. And then we just expect people to come here and then somehow just integrate and just come to terms with the fact that things are different here. I mean, and then you see these horrible stories in the news in Britain and in Australia of these horrible and horrific crimes happening, and then the perpetrator turning around and going, "Oh well, I just didn't understand that was wrong."
Mm-hmm.
Now, I honestly think that that's an absolute load of bull. I'm not going to say that the second part of that. I think it's a load of bull. But I think it's just absurd that we've got a judiciary that then turns around and goes, "Oh yeah, well maybe," and I think that's part of the problem as well. Like I think it just needs to be those expectations that, like the Danes have, and I mean, I don't think anyone, as much as people go around saying that this sort of thing is far right, I don't think anyone could characterize the government of Denmark as far right.
Mm. No, absolutely right. Well, this is a very important issue, and I'm sure it'll get a lot of pushing forward over the next election cycle, because it's definitely a moving vote potentially. Again, if you look at reform in the UK, they've got some very specific views here and are talking about kicking people out of the country, and they're sort of Trump light, really, in many ways. Just another chart you've got, and I think this is we touched on it a little bit before, but the household formation problem when housing is so expensive is really interesting. And you've got a chart there which is absolutely fascinating, a Canadian piece of information, but I think you can read across this into Australia as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the numbers in terms of the cost of housing relative to incomes, you sort of take everything into account, interest rates, you name it, Australia and Canada at a nationwide level are almost bang on par with each other. So I think that this is very much applicable when it comes to Australia. Now, this particular piece of information comes from a group called Abacus Data, which did a bunch of polling on this. And 55% of Canadians have said that the cost of housing has impacted them in terms of when they were going to have a child, or if they were going to have a child, or they're having fewer children as a result of the cost of housing. And I think that this is just absolutely notable. And I'm just going to add just something interesting just on Australia on this one. As of the latest data from the ABS, Australia's fertility rate is 1.5. Now, a decade ago, when alarm bells were ringing in Japan and SBS was doing documentaries on the demographic collapse of Japan, their fertility rate was 1.5.
Mm.
So I think that we are heading down the same road as the Japanese, except we aren't I mean, at least in Japan, they're attempting in various ways, some small, some larger, to actually arrest that fall. Whereas here in Australia, we just go, housing price go up. And then the housing minister says, housing price go up. Sustainable house price rises. And, you talk to the opposition, it's housing price go up. Everyone talks about, oh, you're pushing up housing prices and that's bad and blah, blah, blah. But when you actually ask them, do you want higher housing prices? They go, oh, yeah.
No, absolutely. And it shows you the disconnect. Now it's interesting, of course, we had the Costello baby bonus some time ago, and that had a little productivity bump in terms of producing babies. But these days, housing formation a lot later, size of household formation a lot smaller. It'll be really interesting to see what the next census data shows us on this in Australia, but the trends are very clear. And then, of course, the question is, well, if you want to grow the economy in terms of numbers of people, then you've got no choice but to bring in those migrants because we're not making enough at home. So it's a real problem. But, of course, the difference is that when you actually have homegrown population growth, you can plan for it because you know roughly the timing of when they need to go to school, etc. Whereas if we have migration, you got this massive boom that comes in, and then we need more hospitals, more of this, more than that, more roads, all at once. So you can't plan for it the same way.
Indeed, I was looking at the birth rate data surrounding the baby bonus the other day, and I actually have a suspicion that the baby bonus actually covered up the impact of the explosive rise in housing prices seen around the turn of the millennium. I suspect that that's a big factor, and without that, I actually think that the baby bonus would have actually been significantly more successful if housing prices magically stayed as affordable as they were around the 1999-2000 mark, which was, according to data from PropTrack, the death of broad-based housing affordability in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important observation. Well, we've got one killer slide left, and this is actually really, really interesting because it goes right back to US trade, shipments, and what's happening in the US economy.
Indeed. Now, this one actually I originally produced for an article at Macro Business. It actually ended up going viral on US financial Twitter, which I thought was rather nice. But anyway, this shows the Cass Freight Index, which is a trucking index based on the number of shipments going across the US. Now, the thing I like about this index is it's relatively basic. It's just the level of shipments balanced to the number in January 1990. And because it is very seasonal, it's not seasonally adjusted. So obviously, big amounts of volatility, around Christmas, around New Year, winter, you name it, for the US. So what I've done here is I've taken specifically the latest data which was available, which is up to August, and charted all the Augusts across time since this particular part of the index was available through the Federal Reserve. And there are two notable weak points in this. August 2009, which is the US GFC recession, and August 2001, which is the US .com recession. So I think that's rather interesting that we are seeing basically recession-level conditions within the US goods economy. And I just think it's worth noting that I think it was Craig Fuller from FreightWaves, which monitors all the various flows of freight and etc. across the US in terms of volumes. His data is showing US trucking volumes down 20% year on year. So the US goods economy is very much in a recession. And I will add something that's rather interesting, and this is an article that's coming for subscribers over the weekend at burnout-economics.com. And what's interesting is because of the giant crackdown that's currently going on in the US on illegal immigrant truck drivers, the number of truck drivers on the road has fallen significantly. Some say by as much as 20%. And there's a theory, a fairly robust theory, I would say, that this could put massive upward pressure on US truck-based transport costs, even though volumes are deeply depressed. And there's and just an additional angle, if the US economy does refire, if Trump does a stimulus or whatever, there's very much a possibility that that could be an inflationary driver for the next cycle.
I think this is a really important conversation, Tarek, from 2 points. Firstly, the direct impact currently on the economy in the US. And of course, we are without compass now, with a lot of the public available data now not being made available, and that's a problem for the Reserve Bank the Federal Reserve in the US to sort of make any sort of decisions. But the other point is that the economy overall is looking quite healthy because of the massive boom in the AI story in the US over the last 18 months to 2 years. And it's now fascinating to me that we've had the IMF, the Bank of England, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, and a few others as well, all saying, well, hang on a moment, folks, maybe this AI boom is unsustainable, and maybe there are going to be echoes of what happened in the dot-com boom bust back in the 2000s. And, the latest cross investments from, some of these big AI companies that have no revenue to those big technology companies that have massive amounts of revenue, all throwing money at each other, hoping that they can sort of keep the Ponzi scheme bubbling, seems to me to be a very important clue here. And when you actually go back to the good story that you just highlighted in that chart, well, maybe the rest of the US economy is looking a lot sicker than actually you might suspect, because of the AI overlay that's actually masking a lot of this. If the AI overlay goes pop, that could be a very significant and quite troubling event. So I think very important data to watch ahead, despite the fact that the public data is not available now.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it was a Harvard University study which was published in Fortune magazine. I think it was yesterday.
Yep.
Found that without the AI boom, the US economy would have only grown by 0.1 of a percentage point across the first 6 months of 2025. And I think that there's something very notable about how this is different to .com. Now, don't get me wrong, in terms of stocks, yes, it's very similar to .com, very frothy, lots of optimism, lots of, this is going to change everything, and then, the market's going to go to the moon forever and ever. There is very much that perception. But what is very much driving the economy in this instance, and what makes this arguably even more dangerous from an economic perspective, is the fact that what is driving the US economy is real. It's not just the wealth effect from the rising stock market. It's capex. It's building new data centers. It's building new power stations. It's building new infrastructure in those areas where they're building data centers and power stations. It's the water infrastructure to cool the data centers and all these various different things that has to happen. So there's very much a physical presence in the economy of a very real impact that it's having to help boost the US economy in a physical way, rather than during the dot-com bubble, where it was much more wealth effect driven, and then the market crashed, and then the sort of usual wipeout occurred. So I think it's a lot more risky that this could all go pear-shaped. And I think as well, I think in a lot of ways there's a rather ironic sort of twist here, whereby AI could be very successful. AI could, sort of revolutionize things. It could put a lot of people out of a job, but then you could end up with a situation where AI isn't terribly profitable. They spent all this money on it. They have to slam on the brakes on the construction of these data centers, and various infrastructure and various capex. And then they turn around and then you've got a situation where all of a sudden this thing that's played a huge role in supporting the US economy just takes a massive dive. You end up with, by the same token, a load of people losing their job as companies cut costs and they try to automate these positions. So where you've got a world in which AI revolutionizes the US economy and then crashes it, which I think would be a rather sort of ironic situation.
Absolutely. And I will just quickly say that, of course, in the dot-com, the hidden story was actually all the big infrastructure investments that the telcos made, and they laid a lot of dark fiber that never actually got used for a long, long time. And they actually took quite a big hit through that cycle. So there was an infrastructure fault line that was created around the dot-com too. And I do think that's actually a closer analogy to what we might be seeing in the AI story too. So really, really fascinating. We're going to watch this, I think, over the next little while, because who knows. Tarric, that was a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much for all the work on the slides. Links and things below, of course, for those who want to follow Tarric on Burnout Economics and see the other work that he does. And we'll do it all again soon, because, boy, there's so much to talk about.
Well, definitely, mate. I'm looking forward to it. I'll see you then.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.